Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. I'm going to show you another game featuring the Czech Benoni. You might remember that this opening featured in the game between Pragnananda and Wei Yi. And, well, I mentioned that I'm not completely convinced by this opening. I find it slightly dubious because black gives away so much space. But clearly it's an opening that divides opinion, and there were a lot of comments on it. And I'm going to show you another game which I mentioned at the time. It's one of my favourite games with this opening. Garry Kasparov against Tony Miles. I'm an admirer of both these players. Tony was one of the best, or he was the best English player for a period, and well, he was the first English grandmaster of the the modern era, and well, a real hero of mine for his play on the board and his somehow his style off the board. He was really bohemian actually. This game was played in a match, Kasparov against Miles, played in Basel in 1986. They played 6 games. It was just kind of a challenge match. And afterwards, well, Miles, I should say, lost the match 5.5-half. And Miles said afterwards, I thought I was playing the world champion, not a monster with 100 eyes who sees all. Yeah, Kasparov just was in his element. Anyway, this was game 1. And as you can see, there's another Czech Benoni on the board, characterized by this sort of central locked pawn structure. And this is a wonderful game. And actually, it is not at all one-sided. It's really interesting. So we see that Kasparov goes directly for g4, squashing black on the king side. In the Prague-Wei Yi game, we had bishop e3. And Prague also went for g4. And in some ways very similar. But anyway, let's see how Kasparov plays it. Knight e8 from Miles. So this knight may spin out to c7 to support b5. And sometimes it comes to g7 after g6. And also this lets the bishop out in some cases. Bishop d3. And now instead of g6, Miles goes for a6, so wanting to get in b5. a4 from Kasparov, squashing the break. Rook b8 anyway. And rook g1. So this is even more aggressive than we saw from Prague. Kasparov wanting to get things going on the queen side, on the king side as quickly as possible, just envisaging a pawn storm. So really direct from Kasparov, very interesting. Knight c7. So Miles switches the knight round, looking to push with b5. b3. That's so. Just for a moment, Kasparov just kind of puts the brakes on and solidifies the queen side. And I think the idea is, well, if he played h4 straight away, then b5, and somehow, in these kind of positions, you never know, there could be a c4 here. So I think with b3, I think Kasparov is just waiting to see how Miles plays in this position, because now if b5, then I think with the pawn on b3, this is even more solid, and it's possible just to hang on to that pawn. And you're not going to be surprised by a c4 move, because that will just be taken. So at b3, yeah, black has to slow down for a move, and Miles plays rook e8. And now Kasparov continues on the king side, and Miles decides, okay, if this is happening, if h4 is happening, then I need counterplay desperately. Otherwise, this is such a natural pawn storm. And of course, this can be taken. But after knight f8, things aren't so clear actually. I mean, first of all, this knight could well bounce into f4. That's interesting. So after h5, bishop d7, you can see there are now 3 pieces on that pawn. Okay, that can be defended, but you know, maybe the queen could come around here, or maybe, yeah, I think probably queen here to b7 is the way to go. And you know, that's definite counterplay if black can try and get that pawn. But after b5, I think correctly Kasparov just decides, right, keep going on the king side, because actually with the pawn still on a6 and the a file closed, actually the queen side is still pretty closed. You know, if black takes here, then you can just recapture with the pawn, and you know, this rook really can't achieve that much on the b file. And black's pieces, particularly with that pawn here, are very locked in. You can go for a5, but, well, yes, it gives the knight a route here, but also allows white's knight into b5, locking out the rook. So after g5, Miles played knight f8, which I think looks natural. If that knight can get into f4, even if a pawn is given up, then black is going to have some counterplay on the e file. And I think, you know, this introduces or reveals another element to this position, which is the fact that white's king doesn't have a natural home to go to. It's kind of staggering around in the middle. Queen side, bit too open. King side, well, with these pawns advanced, also pretty open. Is it safe in the middle? Well, at the moment, yes. But after a maneuver like this, then things could get tricky. So that's one thing that black has in his favour here. So Kasparov just continued with h5, and I think that's a very good policy. So Miles just played bishop d7, holding attention for the moment. And I think here, to me, a5 seems like a very natural move. And if pawn takes pawn, again, recapturing with the pawn, not the bishop, because that would allow the knight in here. But if one recaptures with the pawn, it keeps, you can see the knight is completely locked in. The rook, of course, can come to b4, but it's not doing too much. But Kasparov is in a hurry. Played knight h2. Perhaps looking to spin round here. At some moment, perhaps queen f3, and the queen can join the attack. Pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. So you can see actually why Kasparov wanted to keep this pawn on a4, because it still controls the b5 square, and he wanted to recapture the bishop, which is reasonable. So there's another way of doing it. And it's a huge problem for black. You can see these minor pieces just are so bottled in by these pawns here. I mean, this, I think this particular position really shows why the Czech Benoni is often deemed as just dubious, really, because white has so much space and the minor pieces are just really cramped. They lack space, basically. So Miles lashed out f5. I think he has to. You know, Tony was someone that really understood about the activity of pieces. And good or bad, f5, I think, just has to be played. But of course, it's incredibly dangerous because it starts to open up black's king, as well as white's a little bit. I mean, white can just take here and go queen f3. And knight here, this is also very promising. But Kasparov took on f5 and brought the knight back. Queen d7. You can see that black has gained a little bit of freedom. The rooks are now connected. The queen comes up, supports the bishop. These minor pieces are still struggling to get into the game. Knight e3. Just looking at that bishop. And e4. Well, you know, that has potential to stir things up a little bit. Still not absolutely obvious, but it does take away the square from the queen. Actually, that is very important. On the downside, it opens up the long diagonal. Now, who's going to use that? Well, we'll see. Bishop b2. Looks like white. Bishop d8. Okay, so black has managed to shuffle a little bit, and that gives the rook a little bit of freedom. Still blocked by the e-pawn, but that bishop may bounce out to a5. So that's interesting. You know, black is trying to get somewhere. Okay, how would you play with white in this position? There's your first challenge. What would you do with white here? White to play. How are you going to try and pursue this attack? I mean, there are a lot of very tempting moves here. Kasparov played knight back. I think he's looking to swing this knight over to the king side. However, fairly simple move. Queen c2 looks pretty good, with the idea of castling queenside, connecting the rooks, and then you get going on the king side. That seems to be a very reliable move, and you can see that with these pieces packing out the queen side, the king is actually going to be very healthy, very safe on the queen side. But knight e2, it starts to get a bit tricky. Queen f7. Queen d2, I think, is still a good move here, looking potentially to castle queenside. But knight f4, things start to go wrong. By the way, apparently both players were running pretty short of time, which made life interesting. Bishop c8, you know, the kind of move that's very unexpected. A retreat, but actually rather annoying for white, because the queen hits the knight, and instead of retreating, understandably, Kasparov instead, I mean, this is classic Kasparov actually, played rook g4, which is just a fascinating move, just giving up the exchange. Now, Tony didn't do this, but let's just have a look at bishop takes, queen takes. In fact, this would play into Kasparov's hands. And Miles appreciated that, because suddenly white's coordination is fantastic. The king might go to the queen side, allowing the rook to swing across. Might just step up to e2, but anyway, the king in this case is completely safe. I mean, all white's pieces look fantastic there. And then, you know, with the rook here, you can imagine the attack just rolling on beautifully. So Miles understood that and instead played queen e7. Now there is a threat to take here and then take on g5. Now that's a different story. So Kasparov just nudged the rook back. Queen f7 hits the knight. Okay, tacit draw offer. White could still go rook g4, but Kasparov wants more and retreats the knight. But, you know, you could say that Miles has made a bit of progress there because this knight has been forced backwards. Now, black still needs some freedom for his pieces. So knight a8 looks strange, but suddenly, you know, there is potential for this bishop to bounce out here and the knight to come here as well. So Kasparov played a5, which prevents both those moves. However, now the knight can bounce back. I mean, this is really subtle because the b5 square is available. And this is a really difficult position to control. On the surface of it, you know, white still looks pretty good here. But actually the coordination isn't great. That's a big problem. You know, if we could magically put this rook over on h2 or h1 or somewhere, and make the king a bit safer, it would be good. I mean, king f1 is perhaps the way to do it. It's an interesting idea, and after knight b5, just take it and play knight c4. And actually, the king is pretty safe here. Rook defends here. Black's minor piece is still not brilliant. You know, that is potentially a way to do it. It's nice that the knight hits this one. Still not fantastically clear. One could also sack a pawn like this. But after queen h5, which at first glance looks fantastic, actually bishop f6 is not so clear, because the queen hits the rook in the corner. And yeah, this knight has potential, or you know, could drop back to f8 as well, and the queen can come in. So it's a tricky position. Kasparov went for knight h4. Well, you know, that's very much in his nature, particularly in those days, in 1986. You know, he loved attacking and he's looking to force through g6. Knight b5, but actually things are not so clear. g6, he went for it. And now if pawn takes, then queen f4. In fact, black is absolutely fine here. This knight controls h7, so queen h5 is not a big deal. And, you know, suddenly black has counterplay here. So after h takes, knight takes g6. And here, Miles played a good move. He played bishop f6. But even better would have been knight d4. And if this is taken, then you can see that bishop streaks across the board. And, well, suddenly, I mean, it's still very unclear, but black is better there. But bishop f6 played. I mean, it's still very interesting, and black is really back in the game now, because you can see, yeah, dare I say it, split rooks. If only white's forces could join together, but actually, you know, black has serious counterplay now. And in some ways, you know, black is better coordinated, with the queen here looking to get counterplay. Queen c2. Well, as I mentioned before, this was time pressure, so you know, lots of inaccurate moves here, and you know, there were some very interesting shots that were missed. Miles took on b2. He could have played c4. Really interesting idea. So obviously pawn takes impossible because the rook takes b2. Knight takes c4. Rook takes d5, and the rook joins the struggle. And look at white's king. It's not casting queenside. It's got to hang around in the middle, and that doesn't look particularly secure. Really interesting idea. So c4 looks like a good shot, but Miles took on b2. Still very interesting. Knight takes, rook takes. And once again, c4 was the move. Miles played rook e5, which looks like a very natural move because it blocks the long diagonal and also threatens potentially to switch this way. We'll see what happened in a second, but again, c4 is the move. And actually, you know, black has fantastic counterplay there. Rook e5 played, and now after castles, once white has coordination and is able to swing the second rook across, well, you can see rooks connect, they connect with the queen, and actually this is now fatal. It's interesting, isn't it? Suddenly black's rooks disconnected, not working together, and black's position falls apart. There we are. Split rooks. The rook came back to defend. Knight c4. Attacks this one. Queen check. King here. Rook b7. Miles defending very creatively. And in fact, Kasparov now makes a mistake. He should have played rook takes. I mean, it's very hard to determine. But knight takes d6 actually was inaccurate. And here, again, mistake. I mean, Kasparov should have taken here, and, well, he's better. It's a long story. It's still very complicated, but basically, black would have some chances there. But rook f6 played, And here, Miles would be okay. And rook f6 looks so strong. And now a very unusual move. This is the last move of the time control. e3 is actually quite a good move. Check. If rook takes, queen takes. And, well, obviously there's counterplay here. And if knight takes on f2, attacks this one. I mean, this is a mad position. But basically, it's going to be about equal after this. That's fun. Black should survive. Okay, let's go back. Crazy position. Whoops. Rook f6 just played. Queen h2. Okay, that's the final mistake. And actually, now white is winning again. King a2. That was the final move of the game. They've reached the time control, and probably, you know, Miles had time to stop and reflect and realise, well, he's just completely lost in this position. What's going on? Well, this bishop is attacked and this rook is attacked. And basically black is just losing material. And Kasparov's king finally found safety on the queen side. But what a fantastic game. And I think that shows the pros and cons of the Czech Benoni really well. So, you know, let's just go back. You know, when we had a position like, I don't know, like this, you're sort of thinking, well, how on earth does black break free in this position? You know, these minor pieces look absolutely terrible. But somehow Miles managed to find some freedom. And then when it got to this position, around about here, still a complete mess, but actually Miles is doing all right here. Knight d4, or even in the game bishop f6 gave black some excellent counterplay, but finally with coordination white was winning. Brilliant game, really interesting game from both players, two absolutely fascinating players. So there we go. Maybe I'll revisit the Czech Benoni again, because there are some other fantastic games. I'll have to find a game where black wins, actually, just to redress the balance. Just to mention that Norway Chess is coming up soon. Classical chess tournament, some of the strongest players in the world, including, of course, Magnus Carlsen. So I'll be dipping into that tournament over the next couple of weeks. Thanks for watching.